Yay. I could have said, oh, tempora. Something I tell some of my student teachers that in our program to use with their students when they want to get them to calm down, is to teach them a few responsive phrases to get their students to gather in. This is the postprandial session. I hope that you don't decide to take a nap. But let me introduce myself. I'm Jacqui Carlon from UMass Boston. I'm the grad program director there, and I have the great good fortune of running our grad program and training high school Latin teachers. That's our prime audience in the grad program. But I also teach freshmen in a course that's required in a cohort model retention program that we have. So I get 130 freshmen or so in a class every fall who don't know what classics even is. And they have no idea why they're being required to take a classics course. And so I have to start out by explaining who we are and why we matter, which I think is, it's been an interesting challenge. This is a community of students who they're completely uninhibited, which is fabulous. So one year in the early years, I didn't do that. I didn't explain what classics was and why they were in this course. And so on the second class, I said, if ever you have any questions, I want you to feel free to ask them. It doesn't matter what it is, because if you have a question like that, somebody else in the class probably does too. And this girl shot her hand up. And I said, yes. And she said, why do we have to take this class anyway? Marvelously, just sort of unedited. And I thought, that's a darn good question. And one that I hadn't even thought about addressing until that point. So my view of classics is that with our courses, with our by nature interdisciplinary courses, right? Language, culture, literature, history, archaeology. With our courses and with the areas that we study, we provide an ideal laboratory for the consideration of everything that is human. And it's at a distance. It's 2,000 plus years in the past. And therefore, it's safe space. It's safe space for consideration of questions that really pertain to all societies in all times, but without any sort of loaded or vested interest. We can talk about all those things that are human in this laboratory of the past. And I also tell them that, this is fundamental to Western tradition, but I also have a tendency to couch that, at least over time, in you have to know the enemy because he is us, right? And because I want them to understand that those kinds of preconceived notions come from the appropriation of elements of the past that really don't actually represent the past. And so for me, my approach to my classroom is to open that all up so that we can look at the real Romans, the real Greeks, for good and bad, and how they can, in fact, inform our own behavior and our own understanding of our own societies and economic and historical traditions. UMass Boston is a great place to do this. For those of you who don't know about us, we are an urban campus. Until 2 years ago, we didn't have any dormitories. We now have one dormitory for 1,000 freshmen, and after that, they're on their own. Most of our students are commuter students. Some only commute from apartments that are nearby, but most of them commute from a fair distance. Some of them from as far away as Cape Cod, and they're driving an hour and a half each way, back and forth, or sometimes more, to get to the campus. There is no university on Cape Cod. So once they're finished with Cape Cod Community College, they have nowhere to go except a good long distance. And we're one of the places they come. We are a majority minority university. We're about 53% minority students. We speak 95 languages on campus. We are more than 55% first generation. And we have, at last count, over 550 veterans in our student body as well. Right now, we're about 13,000 undergraduates and 4,000 graduate students on campus. When you walk the halls, you're walking the world. It is, for me, it's the best place in the world to teach because of that. You hear languages and you don't even know what that language is. It's really neat. And so you can stop and ask, what is that? Oh, this person's from Congo, and speaking to some of the other students in the university who are from Congo. So it is the ideal place, I think, to talk about diversity, because our students in our classes, in classics, look just like our student body. There's no difference. And when I look around my class, it looks just like the hall, right? Which is how I think we ought to be defining diversity. What does diversity look like in your classroom? I mean, you can't, where are you going to get diversity? You have to get diversity from the student body that you have. And what you want is your classroom to look like the student body of the university. And we don't seem to have had any difficulty doing that. And so I've been, ever since I put this topic in to talk about, I've been thinking about, well, what is it that we do that attracts and keeps those students in our classroom? Obviously, my 130 students are required. I don't have any choice. But I want them to want to take more courses afterwards. And so it seems to have happened organically with us, but it really hasn't. There's certainly some ways to think about it. I would also mention that we are not just diverse racially and ethnically. We are also extremely diverse socioeconomically. And to me, in some ways, that's more important than the other two. Our students have a very hard time paying their tuition every semester. We have students who become homeless every semester. We have a food pantry. We have safety nets for folks who not only are food insecure, but who literally may become homeless tomorrow. I had a student a couple of years ago who in the second week of school had her mother decide that she was going to move in with her boyfriend, who just moved to a halfway house, and that this 18-year-old girl and her 10-year-old sister had to go someplace else. And yeah, I mean, it's scary stuff. And this is not an unusual occurrence with the students that we have within our community. Many of the immigrant students have to go to doctor's appointments with their parents in order to be able to translate for them and to make sure that they're secure and well. So there are a lot of things that are going on. A lot of our students are at the average age of our undergraduates is 24 to 25. We have a lot of returning students who had a rough time the first time out in college, or many who never went to college. They didn't think it was on their radar. We've got a lot of folks with kids. So one of my colleagues, for example, recently put into his syllabus the fact that there might be children in the classroom from time to time, and he wanted the rest of the classmates in that classroom to be aware and kind and accommodating if someone had to bring their child to class. And that's the reality. Daycare falls through, and what is someone to do? We don't want them to miss class. We want them to be there as best they can. My courses, my lecture classes are all recorded and are all available on our Blackboard website, so that if a student has to miss my class for some reason, that student can go and watch the lecture online. So they're just, fundamental things that we can do. And instead of saying, well, no, you have to come and hear my lecture. Well, that's sort of silly, isn't it? I mean, I want them to come and I incentivize them to come, but life happens. And sometimes really critical things happen to our student body. It's much more likely to happen than in sort of a traditional college setting. We have a fairly substantial LGBTQ population on campus as well. We have students going through gender transitions, and it's a campus where they're safe. And I'm extremely proud to be able to tell you that, because the campus policy is very specific about creating safe spaces for these students. Now, that does not mean, however, that those safe spaces exist in every classroom. Right? The university can have a policy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay for those students. And so what do we do? Well, what I'm hoping, first of all, is that when I come to my classroom and that when any of us comes to our classrooms, we don't make any kinds of assumptions. Right? And that's a hard thing to do, right? Because we all come with our own biases. And no matter how hard you try to rid yourself of those biases, you can't. I'm a historian of the early empire, and I'd like to think that, oh yes, of course, I'm completely unbiased when I come to my examination of history, but I can't be that because I am an accumulation of all of my experiences of the world. But I want myself, and I would hope that all of my colleagues will think about those kinds of built-in biases that you don't even know you have, or you don't really acknowledge that you have, certain assumptions that you make about the student that's sitting in front of you. And very early on, particularly at this institution, I learned never to assume. Don't assume that they've had any common experience with you or with the person sitting next to them. Don't assume that they, in quotes, know something. Don't make a cultural reference without explaining it. We've got a lot of immigrant students who don't know my cultural references, which, by the way, are also those of a dinosaur. I confess. So I tend to come to my classroom never making that kind of assumption. And I try to think heavily about all of my built-in biases, whether it has to do with someone based on their race or national origin, whether it has to do with religion, or just other cultures in general. And when you do that, what happens is that you can open up discussion, areas of discussion within the classroom to get input from all of these different perspectives. And for me, this is called the joy of teaching in a diverse classroom. That's where the joy comes from. Because I come away from, particularly my large lecture courses, which have a tendency to be super diverse, right? It's not just graduate students in classics who are all, they're all in anyway, right? Instead, I get this super diverse classroom, and every time I teach it, I come away knowing more, right? Not just knowing more about classics, and knowing more about classics because it gives me new perspectives, new tools with which to re-examine the material that I've been teaching for 25, 30 years. I can go back and look at it with fresh eyes, with the eyes of someone who has had a different experience of the world. It makes for a richness in the classroom that is really remarkable. And we can do this with things like something my colleague Gretchen Umholtz, who teaches paganism and Christianity, told me she did a couple of weeks ago. And that is she was talking about the Jewish diaspora. And she turned to this very diverse class of, she's got about 100 students. She had about 100 students in this class. And she said, okay, so what would you take with you if you had to leave where you were and move to someplace else? What would you take with you? What would you take that mattered to you as a person, that mattered to your family, that mattered to your culture? What would you want to be able to bring with you to some kind of foreign land? And she just opened that up to discussion. And all of the students in her classroom then were able to talk about their own experiences, were able to relate the idea of their own experiences, their own migration, if you will, their own transfer to another culture in a way that was completely meaningful for them. And then they can engage with the material in a different way. But also the students in the classroom come away with this incredible experience that sure is about classics, but it's also about human beings, which isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? We teach the humanities. It's supposed to be all about the human experience. And so there are all kinds of ways to do this. I start out right from the beginning about talking about the tyranny of the dumb, D-U-M-B, right? That stands for dead, but you can't talk to them. Upper class, right? Male, biased writers of the ancient world. So I'm setting them up as straw man right from the beginning. And because I want to teach about the real classical world. I don't want to teach about the imaginary classical world as devised by white European men, right? And, you know, I'm a Brit by birth. I know about imperialism. We got that down pat, right? No question. So I set up these things, and I was telling somebody earlier that in one of these fall classes that I teach, in the second week, I start talking about Mesopotamia and Near Eastern cultures that influenced the Greeks, and that in fact the Greeks, as the Athenians claimed, did not spring full grown from the ground of Greece, that they were in fact immigrants, that they were heavily influenced by all kinds of cultures that they came in contact with, and they stole ideas from those cultures quite readily. And I had shown Egyptian architecture and statuary to these students, and one of my students flung his hand up. Again, they're not afraid. I taught at Tufts for a few years before I came to UMass Boston, and I swear to you that every time I made a joke, they wrote it in their notes. That doesn't happen at UMass Boston. They laugh right away, which is excellent. It's very good for my ego. So he flung up his hand and he said, "So how come they always told us that the Greeks invented columns?" I said, "Because those white European people, they wanted to make sure that, you know, everything traced back to these cultures that they thought were so fundamental to their identity. They didn't want anything to have come from anywhere else than the grand and great imagination of the Greeks." And so it's, you know, I do this right from the beginning, and what that does is it totally opens things up. And there are lots of opportunities to do this, isn't it? We can talk about the treatment of women in the Greek world. We can contrast it to some extent with the treatment in the Roman world. Okay, slightly better. You know, not quite there, but slightly better. We can talk about the hidden voices that we know are there, if only we look for them. So you grab inscription evidence, for example, and there are lots of women in inscription evidence. It's the dumb guys that are preventing us from seeing that. We can obviously talk about, we're reading Herodotus, let's talk about the othering of people and what that does and why that happens. There are lots and lots of opportunities within our classes to open them up. And once we open them up, the kids in the required class will come back. The kids in the required class for us, or in a class they just need to take to get those darn distribution requirements out of the way, right? Oh, I have to have a world cultures class and this Greek civilization class, multicultural perspectives, which is how we teach it now. That will fulfill my world cultures requirement. And they come into the class and they go, "Oh, this stuff is interesting," and they come back and they stay. So this is what I'm trying to say to all of my colleagues in places that are saying, "Well, you know, our enrollments in classics are just terrible." We taught 1,000 students last fall with 9 faculty members. 1,000. And this spring, our numbers are pretty much on par with the same number of faculty. Normally, spring enrollments go down. So we teach a boatload of students. And by my estimate, by the time students graduate, our undergraduates graduate from UMass Boston, between 30 and 40% of them have taken the classics course. That's pretty darn good. And it seems to me that it should be a model that everybody else can follow if they start thinking about ways in which to talk about the real Greeks and Romans and to open up all sorts of avenues for discussion. I do think that we can make what seems impossible possible if we do that. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a traditional printed handout that's being passed around right now. And I will also upload this to the website later. So my name is Charlotte Hunt. I am a second-year PhD student in classical philology at Cornell University. I got my MA and my BAs at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So first, I would like to thank the Our Voices organizers, Amy Pistone, Sky Shirley, Emma Vanderpool, Kat Lambert, and Greg Stringer, as well as my kind anonymous nominator. Just as a brief warning, a lot of my talk will reference or discuss primarily topics like sexual assault. So please, if you feel like you need to step out of the room, do whatever's best to take care of yourself. So teaching difficult topics in the classics classroom is not new, and a lot of thoughtful and helpful material exists on the topic already. Some resources that have made a big impact on my own teaching are listed in the handout, but unfortunately, so many of the resources that are available are best aimed at instructors in positions of relative power and freedom concerning the content that they teach. And so I aim in my talk today to address the issue of teaching difficult topics in the classics classroom, but while a graduate student. So to do so, I begin by discussing the relative position of graduate students within the university bureaucratic structure. And then later I move on to discuss some of the actions that graduate students can take, or at least that I have taken myself when dealing with difficult topics in my classics courses in order to create a safer and more equitable environment for my students and for myself. The graduate students occupy a kind of middle ground between student and instructor. We are teachers, but we often do not control our classes. We are students learning how to teach. We are often not afforded the same freedom as our supervisors, who are also our own instructors, our committee members, our superiors, and who have power over our own education and careers. And so my talk here is meant to address these very power dynamics. I offer some suggestions for how I, at least, have tried to navigate my position as a graduate student, a graduate grader, a teaching assistant, and even as an actual instructor of record, while also trying to provide my own students with the safe and open learning environment. So given the variety of positions and relationships you form as a graduate student teacher, not all of these suggestions are always possible or even relevant. I will also say that all of them require putting in more work. A lot of them require that you put yourself out there and sometimes take a lot of risks, which makes me a little hesitant about offering these suggestions and asking people to put more work in. But this is where I'm at. This is the ideas I have at the moment. Ideally, any of the problems that I'm addressing in these talks would be resolved by just having a discussion with your teaching supervisor. But for a lot of different reasons, that's just not always feasible. Graduate school can be a nerve-wracking, difficult to navigate, and sometimes even unsafe environment. So I hope my own suggestions can at least provide a place to start thinking and talking. Much of this talk has been informed by my own experiences teaching while a graduate student at both a large state and then later private university. I've taught and TA'd courses on Greek and Roman civilizations, classical mythology, Latin, and also for a while a kids' classics summer camp. These experiences, my experience teaching these courses was largely shaped by my fellow graduate students, my supervising faculty and mentors, and the published or online work of other instructors, all of whom I'm indebted to. So based on the classes and the content which I have taught, as well as my own personal history, much of my experiences and struggles as a graduate student instructor have been concerned with the teaching of sexual assault. Therefore, that's what most of my examples are about. However, my choice to focus on this topic does not mean that it is the only difficult topic worth addressing, and I'm really grateful that in a conference like this, we are taking the time to address all of these many different topics. As a graduate student, there are a number of different positions that you might have. You could be a grader, you could be a teaching assistant, or you could be an instructor. These positions involve varying degrees of control over your own class, as well as varying degrees of time spent interacting with students. But hopefully, regardless of your position, Your involvement with your class starts before the semester does. If you're not the lead instructor for a course, you might not be directly involved with course or syllabus design. Often you will be required to follow, at least to some extent, a syllabus that's been designed by somebody else. But if it's possible, it's worth reaching out to your teaching supervisor at this pre-semester stage to see if you can have some involvement. If you are involved or you get involved with course or syllabus design, it's useful to start by taking a step back and looking at what content you're presenting in your course. In a course on literature, for example, which is also, I have more experience teaching literature courses as opposed to, say, archaeology or history courses. So in a course on literature, which stories are you actually planning on covering? If there are any of these stories that you think your students might have trouble hearing or engaging with, how are these stories going to serve your class? Are you including these stories because they're just what you learned as a student? Or is there something about them that contributes to the overall learning goals for your course? So I'm not here to say at all that you should teach difficult stories. For example, I think that when you're dealing with Livy's Lucretia, there's a lot to say about the intersection of power, politics, and gender in that period of time. But I also would not propose that you teach Lucretia just because everybody learned about Lucretia. So this stage of course planning is simply a chance to think about and hopefully critically discuss what content you're actually including in the course. So in a course in translation, it's also important to think about which translations you're going to use. Again, if you're a graduate student, you might be used to the translations that you read as an undergraduate. But at this stage, and especially when you're just starting out your teaching as a graduate student, it's worth starting to collect your opinions on the pros and cons of different translations of the same work. If you do have input into the course design phase, you might want to use these opinions about the pros and cons of different translations to offer some opinions about which translations you should be using in that course, or which translations you should recommend. And even if you don't get to have any input into this part of class, you could use the class as an opportunity to evaluate that particular translation and see if you like it or you don't like it for whenever you do get to a point when you have the opportunity to decide yourself. Because there are a lot of factors that go into translation selection: price, availability, school tradition, so many others, that it's useful to just start thinking about this as you go. When the actual content of the course is settled, then it's time to start thinking about scheduling. So when do the hard stories show up? Are you scheduling more than one difficult story in the same class session? If you're doing that, why are you doing it? And again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't necessarily be doing that. The point is not to suggest that you not include critical content, but it is to suggest that you think about when and how you are doing so and how that's contributing to your course, because it's very much going to affect how your students respond to it and their ability to engage with the material. So as a graduate student, you might also run into a situation in which you do not think that you can trust your supervising faculty member to handle a particular class or reading sensitively. This is an opportunity, if you feel that you are able to and comfortable doing so, to volunteer to take charge on those assignments or those lesson days. This plan might not work if you are, for example, just a grader for the class, but if you do have teaching responsibilities in a class, and you're going to be deciding which ones you're going to take on, this is an opportunity when you might want to cautiously and judiciously pick which days or lessons you're going to be involved with the most. Another opportunity that comes up during the pre-semester phase is the content warning, which are also called trigger warnings. I personally like to have a general content warning for my whole class included in the syllabus, which you can discuss on the first day. I also like to plan more specific content warnings in advance of each difficult lecture or assignment. By providing adequate warnings in advance of traumatic content, you're providing students with the opportunity to take charge of their own learning, to take care of themselves. And that will allow them to better prepare themselves for doing the reading or attending class so that they can get the most out of the content that you're trying to teach. If you're assisting with a supervisor's class, writing a content warning for them or suggesting that they have one at all is one way that you as a graduate student could get involved with some aspect of course design. and also creating a positive learning environment for your students. So in terms of what I include in my own content warnings, I'm not saying this the perfect way, this is just how I've been doing it. I like to cover 4 main bases: description of the content, acknowledgement of the difficulty, reason for covering the content, and resources for help. So the description of the content, which is the very beginning of the example content warning that's on the handout, which will also be online later, doesn't have to be a condensed version of the assignment or the lecture. The goal is to give enough information that students with histories of trauma, of any type of trauma, will know if they're going to be affected by the content. Then they can more adequately take care of and prepare themselves for class. For example, the content warning that's on the handout is one that I have used for Ovid's Cockney and Philomela's story. So after the letter A, you see, this myth contains graphic depictions of rape, sexual assault, violence, and cannibalism. This lets a student who has been the victim of sexual assault or who knows somebody who has know that this particular myth might affect them personally. On a less serious level, it also lets students who might just be grossed out by cannibalism know that this story is going to gross them out. So this part of the warning is meant to give enough information that students with a wide variety of experiences can be informed enough to do what is best for their own education, which itself is individual to each student. The next part of the warning, the acknowledgement of difficulty, which is after the letter B, is there to let the students know that you empathize with them. It lets the students know that you, their co-instructor, their TA, their instructor, whatever the role is, recognize how much otherwise invisible work it might take for them to participate in this part of the course. And hopefully, this empathy also makes the student feel more supported in your class and therefore more capable of participating and learning. I always like to include a brief justification for why I'm including this particular myth or story in my class, which is after the letter C. This, again, doesn't have to give away your whole lesson plan, but I find it important to let the students know that you're not exposing them to this kind of content for superficial reasons. It also doubles as an opportunity to provide some light guidance for your students when they go into a reading or discussion, so they might have a little bit of an idea of what they should be thinking about when they do the assignment. The last part of my content warning, which is after the letter D, is a collection of relevant resources for students who need help. The collections I have on the handout are mostly specific to Cornell, where I currently teach as a graduate student. And this is so my students know some of the places on campus that exist where they can seek help. As a general rule, I like to make my students aware at the beginning of the semester that they can always come to me to talk if they're having problems that affect them in a class. But this is a personal choice that I have decided to take on. Depending on your position, and especially at the university level and the pre-university level, it's important to also be very clear on your reporting requirements, but I will get back to mandated reporting later in the talk. So once you've given a content warning, it's also important to have a plan in place for what happens if a student comes to you and says, I can't handle this content. And there are a lot of ways that you can think about this depending on your class, and course requirements, and so on. At the university setting, at least, there are venues through which students can receive official accommodations, but these official accommodations can often be difficult or incredibly expensive to receive. So I think it's important to also have your own personal plan for informal requests for accommodations. So one option that I've used is alternate assignments, like working on a different story, or even just maybe having the student write things down instead of actively participating in class discussion. So a lot of things can happen once you're actually in class teaching difficult content. And one situation that I've run into as a discussion or section leader and an instructor of record has been inappropriate comments made by students. If a student makes a comment that treats your material inappropriately or that you think would make other students feel uncomfortable or unsafe, you can turn this into a learning opportunity. If you're not leading the discussion, but you feel comfortable doing so, you might interject and try to redirect the conversation. And if you are leading the discussion or the section, you can definitely interject and lead the conversation elsewhere. So as an example, one time while discussing Hera and Zeus in the Iliad, a student of mine made a comment that strongly implied that all women should be subservient in marriages. So this was my first semester of leading a discussion section as a graduate student. So my first instinct was to just say, no, that is not how it should be. But I also didn't want to like shut down the whole conversation and make the student not want to come back to class or anything like that. So after taking the time to calm myself down, then I started asking her questions and the whole class questions as well. So then we as a whole class could turn this into a discussion about things like point of view and whose voices are prioritized in the text. Why might you have this particular opinion of Hera in the Iliad, and what in the text is giving you that particular opinion? So it's really productive to have a lot of different viewpoints expressed during class discussion, but it's also really important that nobody be turning anybody else away from your class, and for students to think critically about what in their own lives, as well as what in the text, is shaping their opinions, as well as it being important for you as the instructor to ensure that everybody feels comfortable voicing their ideas. So something very similar can be accomplished with comments on written assignments or through inviting students to come into your office hours, which in my experience they've been reluctant to do. But coming in and just having a discussion. So as a TA, you might also run into a situation in which your supervisor themselves says something inappropriate. Depending on the severity of what's happened, your own comfort level, and the involvement of students and so on, Title IX is an option that exists. Depending on your school's Title IX office, going in and having a chat might not necessarily set off an entire investigation. It's worth finding out if that's the case, in case you do decide that you want to go talk to them so that you are able to make an informed decision about whether to approach Title IX. Within the class itself, depending on the level of power that you as a graduate student instructor feel you have, this could also be an opportunity to do that same sort of conversation redirection. And also a time when I would really recommend leaning on your fellow graduate students for help and advice, and especially any graduate students you know who've worked with that particular instructor. Back on the subject of reading assignments and translations, what are you supposed to do if your translation is inappropriate and or causes the students to misunderstand the text? If you can, it's most helpful to try and predict what the students will find confusing. For example, some versions of Ovid's Procne and Philomela make the nature of the assault opaque, more or less so than the actual original Latin text. So when I've TA'd for a course using Reed's edition of the Humphreys translation, some of my students were confused and referred to the assault in the myth with, and this is their terms, things like love or forced love. Similarly, when teaching mythology of Latimore's Iliad, I often had students who were confused about the nature of Achilles and Briseis' relationship, based on Latimore's use of the term mistress for Briseis. So if you can realize these confusions before they read the story, or in my case, it took like a semester of teaching the class to realize that they were going to make the same mistakes in later semesters, then you can preface the assignment with some extra explanation or guidance so that they are not going into it without knowing what's going on. But since every student is coming in with their own varied experiences, you're never going to be able to predict everything they say. Therefore, it's helpful to come up with some strategies to use on the fly. My personal default, if something catches me by surprise, is to just start slowing down and analyzing the exact wording of what's going on with the students. So first we can get some idea of what they think is happening. Then I can come in with my own understanding of the text, which might have been informed by other translations or reading it in the original. And then we can talk about this back and forth. If I have time to return to the story later, I also use it as an opportunity to look at a few different translations of the same passage, so we can start talking about why translators make certain choices. All of these suggestions are meant to help cultivate a safe learning environment for your students, safe so that they can engage as fully as possible with the often horrific text that we so often deal with. By cultivating that kind of environment, your students are also likely to become more comfortable with you. And given the kind of content that you're dealing with, your students might even come to you when they have problems. If you're in a position to be holding conversations with students, whether you lead a discussion section or you hold office hours or have some other arrangement for student contact, it's really important at the university level at least to know your school's Title IX and mandated reporting policies. Depending on your institution, you might receive extensive training on this regard. You might also receive no training at all. You might not even know if you are a mandated reporter. But it's very clear, it's very important to be clear on your university's regulations on this. I promise they have regulations somewhere. Because these are going to dictate what the school expects you to do if a student reports certain kinds of trauma or experiences to you. It's important to be clear on these expectations sooner than later, because it's going to affect how it's best for you to act in the moment, and you might not have time to go and ask your supervisor what you're supposed to do. At the university level, whether you're a mandated reporter depends on your state and your specific institution, but if you're acting in any kind of teaching role, even as a graduate student, and a student reports behavior is a violation of your school's Title IX policy, you might be required to then report that to the Title IX office, which is what being a mandated reporter is. If you're a mandated reporter and you think a student is about to disclose reportable behavior to you, you're probably going to want to gently interject and remind them that you have an obligation to report, which is so awkward and uncomfortable for everyone involved. But it's really important that the student understand that in reporting something to you, they might be kickstarting a larger process. And it's really important because a student's agency in dealing with their own trauma will have a huge effect on the success of their recovery. And therefore, they need to be able to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to report something to you. Along with the stipulation, I also find it useful to have on hand already information about where a student can go for help if they want help from a non-mandated reporter. And I had that in the content warning too. I specify a little bit where students can go in case they're not ready for something to go all the way to Title IX. So my last thoughts have to do with my own experience as a graduate student, an instructor, and a person, because as people, graduate students might have their own history of trauma. And you as a graduate student might very well be put in a position where you're teaching topics that bring up your own history of trauma. You might also, like me, specifically volunteer to teach that content because it's important to make meaning out of what's happened to you, and because a lot of these stories can be used in really valuable ways for education. In these cases, you need to give yourself permission to take care of yourself, which is so easy to forget. Can you think about what you need in order to teach these topics? And can you ask yourself or your friends or your supervisors for that help, for what you need to be able to do this successfully? Some things that have helped me specifically in the past have been giving practice lectures out loud, like to my cat, for example. So she's a great listener. So that I know what parts of the lecture I'm gonna have trouble most vocalizing. I've also, in the case of having a very supportive supervisor, had a supervisor offer to discreetly take over if I give them like a hand signal that I'm having trouble, so that we can switch and I can like have a quiet moment without the students realizing that there's something going on. And I also like to have a backup plan for my lessons in case I need to sort of mid-lecture change course without the students realizing necessarily that there's something happening. And there are all sorts of other strategies that I personally use, but the point is to take a moment to like think to yourself about what you need to have the support to be able to get through a difficult class session. Many of these discussions, or many of the situations I proposed here regarding teaching as a graduate student are obviously helped just by having an open conversation with your supervisor, but it is the uncomfortable truth as a graduate student that such conversations with people who have a lot of power over you do not always happen. And so I hope I've at least gotten you thinking about some strategies to make the best out of your position for yourself and your students. Thank you.
Should I stand in front of that floor to get like mic stuff, or is this? Oh, that's the mic.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So they I think he's like.
Oh, yeah, I'm doing slide stuff.
Yeah, but maybe not everybody.
Yeah, and I tweeted out my slideshow, so if anyone wants to follow along, and let's see. Oh, do I need to drag this over? I guess. I think. Oh. Is it?
We muted it, I think.
Oh.
Yeah.
This red button.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Okay,
Okay,
and then you
good.
just have to.
All right, drag it over.
Okay,
All right.
perfect.
All right, so my name is Dominic Machado. I teach classics and Latin at the College of the Holy Cross. This is my Twitter name if anyone is tweeting it, or if you want to ask me questions, feel free to reach out to me either at the email or DM me on Twitter. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, what I want to argue is that community-based learning, by which I mean having your students engage with local communities through teaching, can be an effective and a more sort of inclusive way to teach introductory Latin. And I want to share my experiences, what I've learned from it, the troubles that I've had as I've been going through the process. So to give you the context behind what exactly is going on, so at Holy Cross, we were thinking about how we can teach Latin better, just broadly better, right? So we've been using the grammar and translation model for years, right? And we wanted to update that with more active models of teaching and learning, right? So to that extent, we implemented some comprehensive input, more student assignments that required them to do things with Latin. And the third thing that we were interested in sort of including in this was community-based learning. So having our students go out and teach Latin in their very first semester to local students. And part of the impetus behind this is because of our students who had been in our department before we started teaching this. They had gotten very interested, and one of them is sitting right here, Maya, in the second row, right, who actually decided that they wanted to run an Untitled Chapter in 2017, right, Maya? Yeah, in 2017 with the Worcester Public Schools, right? Of course, as Maya got it rolling, all this stuff happened with Paideia, and we needed kind of a, a shift, okay? We needed to change what was going on. So, okay, we wanted to do this active learning. We wanted to kind of open things up. So we thought, okay, let's go and try to design our own curriculum for community-based learning. Let's have our students engaged with it, and let's see how it goes. Okay, and that was started this fall. So we're one semester in. And so we usually have 3 sections of introductory Latin. There was only one section that had community-based learning, and that was the section that I taught. It was 18 students, and it worked with 2 sites. One is called City View School, which is a elementary public school in Worcester, and the other is an after-school sort of center known as the Marie Ann Center. Okay, don't die on me here, please. Okay, there we go. All right. And our students were teaching Latin to 4th through 6th graders, right? And both of these schools, the populations are, and even the after school site, are majority minority, right? So if any of you have been to Holy Cross, that is not what our campus looks like. We have a primarily white, sort of historically and still predominantly white campus, okay? So it was going to be a cultural adaptation for our students, okay? So I'm gonna talk about kind of 3 reasons why I think, one, this is an effective way of teaching Latin, a more inclusive way of teaching Latin, and then kind of reflect on how these experiences went and what I think I need to do better in the future, okay? So one is it's an exciting and active learning opportunity within a real world environment, right? 2 is that there's an expansion of learning outcomes beyond just mastering forms, right? Beyond being able to translate. And finally, it particularly creates meaning for BIPOC students within the classroom, okay? So those are the 3 reasons why I think Latin pedagogy can be improved and made more inclusive by engaging in community-based learning. So a little bit of the theory behind this. So community-based learning as a form of active learning, right? We're all aware of Latin using comprehensive input as active learning, and we've seen the positive benefits that have come to it, right? Community-based learning is a sort of different actuation of that, right? So the National Survey for Student Engagement shows that community-based learning is among the most impactful practices in promoting student success and engagement, right? So we've seen on a national level that these type of community-based programs help student learning. David Call has argued that CBL plays a key role in activating learning by immersing students in real-world settings with high stakes. So the idea is that students really do learn best when they're forced to take what they've learned, they apply it in a real-world setting, and because it matters, right? Students are forced to take responsibility for their actions beyond just their grades, okay? Now, here's what I have observed. So after this first semester, right, I've noticed that student enjoyment and learning in the course were improved by community-based learning. Okay, so as of yesterday, I didn't have any numbers to back it up, but magically the course reviews from the community-based learning office came in yesterday, so I had to scramble to run all the numbers. So I actually have numbers to back this up. It's not just general impressions. So 77% of my students believed that they learned more deeply because there was a community-based learning component of the class. 88% of them said that it increased their interest in learning Latin. And on a broader level, 82% of them said that they saw intellectual improvement because of their engagement with community-based learning, okay? And as sort of a measuring stick, this is, all of these numbers are in line with or better than the averages for our college, right? And this includes courses in sociology or anthropology, where it's a much sort of a more hands-on relationship between material and context for community-based learning, okay? The second advantage that I saw is there was practice with Latin as a spoken language, right? And we all know about how that can be helpful, right? And it allows particularly students to learn vocabulary, okay? And it's very helpful for helping them to sort of learn new vocabulary too, right? And there's also incentive for students to learn new material in order to meet the needs of their students. So to give you a couple examples, I had students who realized their kids were really into science and they wanted to learn about science even when they were learning Latin. So they went and researched stuff about Pompeii and volcanic explosions and learning Latin words for rocks and learning Latin words for lava and things like that, right? Things that I was not going to teach them in first semester Latin, but they took it in and of themselves to do that. We had other students who were interested in domestic life. So they pulled up plans of Roman houses and learned the vocabulary for different parts of Roman houses. Students were also super eager to learn how to count. So as you all know, if you've taught Latin, you know teaching numbers is like the worst thing in the world, but they learned numbers because they had to teach them to the students, right? So the students kind of went beyond their sort of standard learning for the course to learn for what they had to do at their site. And I'll read 2 quotes to you from their evaluations that I think kind of get at the idea that active learning is at the heart of what they're doing in community-based learning, right? So it says, I love the CBL component. I was skeptical at first about it, but it aided my learning and it was very fun. Second quote, it helped a lot and added a great experience to teach what I was learning. It aided me in figuring out what exactly was going on in class. And part of this, I think, is driven by the fact, and this again comes from our questionnaire, 82% of my students said they learn better when they have an application to the real world, right? So it makes sense that the students learn more because it fit with their learning style. We knew that students learned well in this way, and we activated that, and I saw positive results. Okay, so our second theoretical kind of lens, right, is CBL can expand learning outcomes. So Sanford and Reiser have shown that community-based learning doesn't just improve student content knowledge, but it also leads to personal development, right? We were talking about teaching humans, right? We want our students to develop personally as well as intellectually, right? Community-based learning allows for that. Sort of a necessary corollary to that is personal development happens, right, as a result of confrontation of difference and dissonance through interaction with different communities, right? And we have our primarily white Holy Cross undergraduates going into majority-minority schools, right? It is an experience of cultural difference that's right outside their doorstep. In terms of benefits to teaching Latin, right? I think we can think of some of these as very important, right? So one big benefit I see is that we have a field where language, identity, and politics really intersect, right? And the students are being forced from day one to grapple with these very issues, to think about, okay, how does my learning of Latin intersect with where I live in the world, what privileges I have, and gets them to think about, well, why do we teach this? Why is it important for people to learn this, okay? And also, students are required to kind of think about their own privileges, right? And they also have to think about the problems that come with community-based learning, right? So one of the things that I have my students do is our community-based learning office comes to my class and talks about ideas of toxic charity and white savior, and thinking about, okay, it's not just, we're not sort of doing service, right? This is not the model we're taking, right? We are engaging with the community and we are sharing with them, right? So it helps them to think about different models of how they interact with their local communities. Now, from sort of what I saw with our surveys, this was the area where we both had our biggest successes and our biggest failings. So 100% of the students said they experienced personal growth due to the class. And to me, that's a massive success. For students to think of a Latin class as a way to grow personally, right? That's really meaningful to me. 94% said they learned more about the problems of our society and the local Worcester community. And 94% also said they learned more about cultural diversity, right? So in terms of what a Latin class does, right, I think this is exactly the point of this conference. We want to have the field of classics be more aware of these issues, right? And by bringing students into local communities, we see this being confronted directly, right? And a couple student quotes to augment this. I love CBL. I found it to be one of the most valuable experiences of my college career. And this comes from an accounting major, right? So someone who might otherwise not have thought about these problems, right? Now they've kind of had the chance to confront it. The second quote, I love the CBL component. It was really great to meet new people and feel immersed in the community, all while learning Latin. Okay. Now, I said, those are the big successes. The biggest failure, and this is on me, only 59% of the students said they understood how our course content, i.e. the learning of Latin, related to the real world experiences they were seeing in the schools that we're working in. And this is the one area where we scored lower than the general population of Holy Cross students taking these community-based learning classes. And this reminded me of what Jacqui was talking about, answering why is it important to think about the intersection of cultural problems, cultural privilege, and learning Latin. And in the rush to get them ready to go to their sites, to continue learning, to teach them Latin, I overlooked this, right? And I know that next year, when I teach a section with a CBL component, this is one of the first things I'm going to address. Why are we doing this community-based learning, right? Why is it important in the study of classics to do this, right? So I think this is a real call to action for myself. Seeing those numbers, I was like, okay, now I know what I got to do next time. Okay. So the third reason is community-based learning and BIPOC students. Okay. So Michelle Strick-Barrett and Isabel Jenkins, who actually run our community-based learning office, recently published an article that CBL courses tend to attract more BIPOC students and that they have better experiences in these courses compared to courses that are not community-based learning. The reasoning behind this is that community-based learning offers different modalities of learning, right? So environmental and socially minded learning outcomes that are different than other courses, right? And these are things that are important to students of color, right? Because they have different expectations, they have different social focuses, and they are unable to engage with them in many standard courses, right? And particularly for the study of Latin, right? Community-based learning has the ability to create meaning for BIPOC students beyond learning a historical language and the privileges associated with it, right? It provides a space where BIPOC skill sets, experiences, and self-presentation are welcome and valued, right? It's not about, oh, you can ace a test because you happen to go to a good school, right? But there's an entirely different skill set to be able to engage with a set of students, right? Who might come from different backgrounds than the traditional Holy Cross student. And it also allows BIPOC students to shape their own version of classics, right? Through their interaction with this marginalized community, they can make meaning in classics for themselves and for the students that they're teaching, right? And their version of classics is necessarily going to be different than the one that we are all used to hearing about, right? In terms of experientially, one thing that I did notice is my class had more BIPOC students than any other Latin class that I have taught. We had, I think, out of the 18, 6 BIPOC students. So much more representative of what the actual campus looks like and a significant improvement on what our Latin classes usually look like. Whether it will result in retention is something that I am very interested to see, but I'm hopeful. So what's next? Next year, I'm very excited to say that all 3 sections of Latin 101 are going to have a community-based learning component. So I'm very excited about that. We are currently applying for a grant, but even if we don't get the grant, we're going to try this out for 3 years. We're going to look at the data. We're going to see how our experiment, our vision works out in reality. Okay, and on my own part, this is what I was kind of alluding to. We're going to revise and expand the curriculum to better integrate certain components into our classroom. So talking about why is this important to do? What is the connection between learning Latin and teaching it to kids in local Worcester public schools? Okay, so thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. And here's a little brief bibliography at the end.
So thank you to our 3 speakers, Jacqui, Charlotte, and Dominic. We're now going to open the floor to questions, discussion. But please, we are going to use the mic so that our live streamers can also hear and everyone in this room can hear. Let's see if there's, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks to all of the presenters. Those were all really interesting. Dominic, I have two questions for you because this is something I've always been really curious about, like wanting to be able to do something like this, but sort of all of the moving pieces are obviously never there. But two things when you were talking. One is you mentioned that it enhances their engagement with Latin as a spoken language. And so I'm curious, just with regards to that, whether you're also doing spoken Latin in your classroom, and if not, how does that work then? And then the second question is in terms of time, how both in your own classroom, the CBL is integrated and, you know, yet the learning of grammar is still given enough time because that's always tricky in college. And then also in terms of the additional time demands placed on the students, obviously with relation to out of classroom work. So those are the two questions.
Yeah. So,
Sorry.
yeah, good idea. Great questions. So the first question was about spoken Latin in the classroom. So I kind of gave them, I do a little bit of comprehensive input. It is not a spoken Latin-based classroom. They do compositions, they do things like that. So I prioritize them creating Latin, writing Latin, but not so much the speaking element of it. I'm trying to do more of it, but that's not my particular comfort zone. The second sort of question about class time. So we had 40 classes. I devoted about 8 or 9 classes to either planning for our students to plan their lesson plans. So I would work with them and talk with them about what things they could do, what resources they could use, and having our CBL office leaders come in and talk about some of the questions and problems that come about with community-based learning. The good news is next year we actually have decided, so we're we're 3 days a week of Latin. So that's a lot to give up in terms of class. I'm glad I did it, but it was stressful at some times. Next year, we're the only language right now that doesn't have a practicum. We are going to have a practicum, and that is going to be our community-based learning prep time, right? We're going to have people who are previously involved with community-based learning to mentor and aid them in that sense. So we're going to get more Latin time and more community-based learning time. And again, it's our belief is that if this is what the other languages are doing, right, we're not taking hopefully an outsized chunk of their time. We're also looking into potentially making it 1.25 credits. Yeah, we're thinking about that.
I also do community-based learning as part of an internship, and we just started, and we were wondering, me and my classmate were wondering if there's a way to engage the students since they're around the same age, they're in middle school, and we've had 2 sessions so far, and so far we've had very little retention.
Actually, I'm going to ask Maya to talk a little bit about this because she's been in the classroom and she can speak to the experiences better than I can if you want to. If you want to, Maya, I don't need to put you on the spot, but you are much more knowledgeable than I am about this.
You've already done that.
Hi, everyone. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're wondering about the students' retention of the information?
More like, so they get them to come back.
Oh, well, it was an after-school program, so they were required to go. Yeah.
School program too.
Oh, okay. Well, so the way that City View Elementary School works is that every student goes to the after-school program, so it's kind of more like an extended day versus an after-school program, and there's transportation from that extended day. So it's really helpful, and that's part of the reason that we chose that school over other schools whose after-school programs didn't offer transportation, that didn't require all students to go. But although Paideia has proven to be kind of problematic, a lot of their kind of methods of evolving from that problem of retention have been really helpful in how I think about it. So I don't make my lesson plan, like when I was writing a curriculum for each week, I didn't make my lesson plans so information heavy that if someone missed it, I couldn't go over it in about 5 minutes. I started out every single day the same exact way. I started out with a ritual. I'd say Salve Discipuli. I'd have them recite there. I'd ask them Quid tibi nomen est. I'd have them say Mihi nomen est, and then I'd give them Roman names, which was really fun for them. And they all made name tags and stuff like that, and they were all very excited about that. So having a ritual that happens every single class is really helpful. Having lesson plans that wouldn't take more than 5 minutes to summarize is really helpful. And kind of having a closing activity is also good to keep them coming back and solving that problem of, retention.
And I'll just jump in and add two quick points. So at least from what my students said, one of the things that they that was really useful for them was asking the students what they enjoyed, right? And so that's where like science came up, or learning numbers came up, right? It's or they some of the students asked to make a family tree in Latin so they could show their parents, right? And the second part of it was I gave them a couple of Latin games to play. So I taught them how to play Duck Duck Goose in Latin, right? Because these are fourth graders after school. They're not sitting still, right? So you have to be prepared that sometimes curriculum isn't always going to be delivered, or I Spy in Latin, right? Yeah, exactly.
Thanks to all three speakers. What I love about where you all came together is just you're trying to change the relationship between the students and the world, the ancient world, and that really came across. And I was just wondering, because this is something that I feel like when you're doing new pedagogy or introducing some of these more student-focused, student-centered forms of pedagogy, is it doesn't always come out in the evaluations what you've done, just like what you were saying about them not understanding what the benefits were or what you guys did in the classroom. So I was just wondering how you deal with that, because maybe, I mean, if you asked a year later or 2 years later, then they would get it. So even if you did tell them, okay, this is what I'm doing and why, they may not get it, or they may not actually have realized. You've done so well that the pedagogy has disappeared. The seams of that have disappeared. So I'm just wondering what all three of you think about that, this short-term versus long-term learning and relationship with the ancient world, because it doesn't always come out, it seems, in the student evaluation at the end of the term. Thank you.
I'm actually always surprised. These are first semester freshmen in the course that I've been talking about mostly, who again didn't get to choose the class, right? It's a required class, and I would say 99% of the evaluations are very positive, but oftentimes they don't. You're absolutely right about the pedagogy and the approach being opaque in those evaluations. They have a tendency to say, this is a great class, or this professor is funny, or she's really interesting, and I really liked her lectures, sort of thing. But they don't, and you know what? I want the pedagogy to be opaque. So I'm not worried about that. What I love to see is that this was really interesting, or that I have students, every time I teach this class, I have at least half a dozen students or more who come up to me specifically at the end of the class and say, I didn't know you could study this stuff. It's really interesting. And, you know, that to me is the great success. And the fact that they are likely to come back and take more classes. Now, I can't quantify that. That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what that statistic is because we've never actually gone and looked to say, okay, how many students coming from here will go on to take more classics courses? And I don't know, and so it's totally anecdotal and a gut sense that I have that this type of pedagogy, you know, really does change the dynamic. But you're right, it's hard to tell, and we do have students who will come up to us years later, you know, when they are about to graduate and say, you know, I still remember that class that I took with you. I think it's all anecdotal. Wouldn't it be nice if we could kind of survey them all? What do you think, Donna?
Charlotte, you wanna go ahead and share your thoughts on it? Because I think the grad student perspective is also really important. Yeah.
So I guess in terms of teaching evaluations, I've had different experiences with teaching evaluations at different schools. I think maybe because the school that I did my master's at also had an MAT program, we had a much more active awareness of pedagogy and being trained to be teachers. Not so much at the school I'm at right now. Not that there aren't teachers who care about pedagogy, but in terms of things like I wasn't involved in the teaching evaluations for the last course that I taught, which is a course I TA'd for 2 professors team teaching. So we were being really concerned about doing all sorts of like experiments with active learning in that class, for example, but as a graduate student, that training wasn't being reflected back onto me. So doing things to like observe and then comment on the teaching practices of graduate students, I think is really important for us to help us improve. But in terms of so I guess basically I'm saying is that I think my talk is more relevant to actually retaining graduate students in the field as future successful instructors, because we have to stay in the field and in the PhD programs to be able to teach these undergraduates later. And so I can only hope that making graduate students feel more comfortable teaching and navigating the power dynamics and bureaucracy of graduate school would mean that there are more of us who are more open to different ways of teaching that would later be passed on to our undergraduate students.
So you don't have evals from the students in your free graduate teaching?
So the question was whether I had evals from students for my graduate teaching. I did in my master's. When I taught discussion sections, I had explicit teaching evals for my classes. Also, when I was a Latin instructor, and then when I taught kids summer camps, we had surveys at the end of camp every week. So after like teaching there for a little while, I could sort of build up the feedback from those and try to apply different methods later. But because the class that I taught most recently at my current school, I didn't lead a discussion section. And then similarly this is like a mythology class that had like 80 people, and then I was a TA, but I didn't lead the discussion section. Same with the Greek Civ classes I taught during my master's. No discussion sections. I was sort of more of a grader and guest lecturer. The teaching evals were not geared to, I guess, evaluate me separately from my supervisors. That makes sense. One thing that was really helpful in my previous class was somebody from the Active Learning Initiative at Cornell, who supervises the postdoc who was teaching the class, came in to evaluate their instruction as well as mine, and then give us some feedback on how to improve as a group. That was more useful, I think, than student evals, which I honestly haven't even seen from that class because they don't relate to me.
I guess my response to that question is it's really scary to think about what is going to happen. But I guess the two things that I think about is one, it's something that like is a personal development for me, is just I guess, and I had to kind of come to grips with this because I was writing a report about what I've done since I've been on campus. And for me, I decided for the first time to put into words that as a classicist, my goal is to make the study of the ancient world more open, accessible, and inclusive. So I think just kind of, for me, the big thing was owning that and making that my narrative to control, right? So if students have problems with that, that's okay, because this is my, this is what I want to do. If someone doesn't agree with that goal, that's okay. And then the second part of that is when I teach the class, I try to bring that out day one and repeat it over and over again. And I try to train them a little bit. So I ask for personal evaluations before they give sort of course evaluations at the end of semester. So I'll ask questions about those things specifically so that they're reminded, this is what we're trying to achieve in the class. And I've noticed then generally after the second evaluation at the end of semester, when they write their final evaluation, I'll see some similar things coming up that are more geared towards that. It's not foolproof because sometimes, depending on the day, the student will write, yeah, they were good. This class was good, without any comment on what substantively it was. But those are some things that I've done to try to, one, help myself deal with potentially getting evaluations that were not great, and two, to kind of help our students think in that same way that we're thinking.
Hi, so for Mr. Machado, I was wondering about, you spoke a lot about the impact of CBL on your students. And so my question is, what work has been done about the impact of CBL on the elementary and middle school students?
Great. And this is something I forgot to mention, that if you did have a question about that, you could ask that, because we're talking about only one part of what's going on. Right. So what are the elementary school students gaining, right? This is a hard thing for us as classicists to kind of step back and evaluate. So one thing we've done is we've talked to teachers, principals about what we want, what they want the elementary students to get out of it, right? And also our students talk to the elementary school students about what they want to do, right? So I think there's sort of three things that we've kind of isolated, right? So Worcester is, or at least City View, where our students are working, is majority Spanish speaking. So one thing that our the teachers on site have noted has been that Greco-Roman vocabulary roots have helped act as a connector between Spanish and English. And there is some research to back that up. I'm a little tentative about claiming Latin helps literacy, because there are all sorts of problems with that, right? But that's a potential thing that we can talk about with this specific population. And again, it's something we want to take data on, right? This is something that we're going to evaluate at the end of the study. The second thing is a major goal of elementary schools now is what's called career and education awareness, right? So interacting with our community, a community that is generally separated from this part of Worcester, right? We are hopeful that hearing about college, hearing about educational opportunities, hearing about things that potentially could be enjoyable to them, right? We can't say that it's definitely going to be a solution, but opportunities and making people aware of them, right? We're hopeful that as we expand, we can deliver this a little bit more specifically. And then kind of the last part of it is I think Jacqui spoke very eloquently about this. This is the language of power, right? And we kind of have to know the enemy. So a little bit of knowledge can help these students navigate the world around them, right? Just a little bit more. And again, it's hard. It can be very hard to nail down concrete things, and that's kind of what we're hoping to do. But those are our kind of initial thoughts along what streams those might go.
Can I ask a follow-up to something you said? You need me to go. Yes. And I just said, it's just about you said in your stat that 6 of the 18 students were in BIPOC.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was because this was a CBL class or because of you, the instructor?
So I think it's because it's a CBL class, because my other classes are not as diverse. I'm a new teacher on campus. My name isn't necessarily a dead ringer for what my nationality happens to be or what I might look like. So I think that if I had to guess based on the other classes that I've taught, and again, that might be skewed by the population who is taking classics courses, but in comparison to other Latin 101 courses I've taught, it's much more diverse than what I've seen.
We have time for one more question. Yes. No, go ahead.
Charlotte, my question was for you, and I don't know whether you've had a chance to serve as an instructor on any upper level Latin classes, or at least upper level enough that you're working with longer texts than what you would run into in a textbook. But even if you haven't, if you've thought about how in a situation like that, where instead of giving a translation, you're dealing with the fact that the students may be going out and finding translations to help them, and then what kind of dictionaries the students are going to work with, and what kind of problematic stuff they may run into those dictionaries. In those situations, how do you think that you would confront that? Would it be at the beginning of the class? What kind of forms would it take along those lines?
Okay, so just in terms of dictionaries, so in terms of Latin experience, I taught Latin 101 with, we were doing a trial version of Eleanor Dickey's new textbook. And then I've done an independent study for third semester intermediate Latin, and we read a lot of Suetonius and then a bit of Cicero as well. So, and then I've done a number of tutoring things as well. So in terms of dictionaries, I always I give students like links to lots of different dictionaries, and then tell them what I don't like about each of them. Because, so like, for example, when I was learning Latin in high school, we used that pink Collins dictionary. I don't like it because it makes up fourth principal parts for verbs that do not exist in the literature, and then it doesn't say that it's done that. Then in terms of translations, for example, when I taught mythology during my master's, we in 1 week read the Hippolytus and we read the Phaedra, and the versions that we happened to be required to use for that class were out of copyright, and so they were written in Victorian English, which presented a number of problems. The most extreme problem was that students who did not, for whatever reason, buy the course packet went out and tried to find those translations on their own, and frequently found this Renaissance play called the Phaedra as well, which is not the same as the Seneca play. So I always had to say, if you're going to find another one, not this one, it's not the right one. But yeah, that was something I had to address in that class, because students frequently struggled more with understanding the English than they did with understanding the text, which just didn't happen to be where I wanted the focus to be in that class. In terms of like picking, okay, so I guess here, in terms of like picking translations and stuff in my dream class in the future, what I would really like to do is actually what Amy gave a talk on at Canvas recently, which was this really cool idea about like surveying students at the beginning of a class to get like student input into what's happening in the class for the rest of the semester. I would really love to be able to do more of that in the future, get students involved in the course design process, whether that'll be possible for like bureaucratic reasons. I'm sure it's different at every school, but it is a dream of mine to be able to do more of that, because I think a lot of what I would like to do is sort of move the students down the totem pole, because I don't think we can solve the problem of power structures in graduate school without totally restructuring graduate school. And so if we're gonna have to accept that a certain level of power dynamics exist, what can we do to like move the power down? I guess is my answer.